Greetings, this is Charles Darwin once again, and we're going to continue looking at the book of Genesis. We've gotten now to the second chapter of Genesis, actually going into about the fourth verse, and we find here, amazingly enough, an entirely separate creation account. The order of the events there's the formation of man, and then the creation of the animals, and then the creation of woman. Now, these events can be forced into the same framework as Genesis 1, but you have to really work at it, and that's what creationists do. They really contort and squeeze this story to make it fit in with Genesis 1. But the way the book of Genesis was redacted, these two accounts are just placed one after the other. There's no attempt on the part of the redactor to make them fit together. We should just let them be free to tell two different stories of creation from the ancient viewpoint. There's no attempt to hide the differences. Notice that in this account, God formed man from the dust of the ground. Now this is something that's very important to many creationists. They like to point out that man was created from literal dust, that is, dry, wind-blown soil. But dust just means matter. If you take it too literally, it can be ridiculous sometimes. There's the joke about the little boy who heard in Sunday school that dust thou art and to dust thou shalt return, and he looked under the couch. And his mom asked him what he was doing, and he said, "Well, I don't know, Mom. Under this couch, somebody's either coming or somebody's going." Well, of course, you don't take the word dust that literally. It just means matter. As a matter of fact, it could even include proteins and DNA. So if you want to make this into a scientific interpretation, which is of course not what it's all about, but if you would like to, you would say that Genesis 2 permits an evolutionary interpretation. I'm not going to go down that route because that's totally unnecessary. And then what you will find is the creation of Eve. And I'll get into that more in the next video. The Garden of Eden is described in a little bit of detail what it's like. It's not entirely a natural place. And Adam is commanded to take care of the garden. This is perhaps a primitive awareness of environmental responsibility. That we're supposed to take care of the natural world, to be its stewards, to till it and to keep it, as God commanded Adam in Genesis 2. The only reason I mention that is because there are so many conservative religious people who are anti-environmentalist, and they do so by disdaining the second chapter of Genesis. The location is also given, not location we would recognize on a map today, but 4 rivers are mentioned: the Pishon, and the Gihon, and the Tigris and the Euphrates. And so the location of the Garden of Eden is specified with regard to modern landmarks. At least they were modern at the time this book was written. That's interesting, because just a few chapters later comes the flood. And creationists claim that the entire geological record, including most of the mountains, there are fossils at the tops of the highest mountains, that all of the layers of sediments that became the sedimentary rocks, even of the highest mountains, the top of Mount Everest, the top of the Andes, that these were all formed during the flood. That the flood basically changed the entire surface of the earth. If that is so, then verses 10 through 14 of Genesis 2 make no sense whatsoever. How could you possibly identify the location of the pre-flood Garden of Eden in terms of post-flood geographical landmarks? Well then, a picture is presented of life before agriculture and before civilization. That's really what the Garden of Eden may represent. It represents kind of a perfect world. Then when civilization came along, this was the fall. This was the beginning of large-scale sin. Not that there was no sin before that, but the writers of Genesis believed very strongly that the big civilizations, the big agricultural civilizations, Sumeria and Assyria, were evil, and that the good life could be found in the Israelites who tended their sheep out in the hills. And that civilization, therefore, and the end of hunting and gathering lifestyle was actually a fall, and that was the beginning of large-scale sin. It even says that the man and his wife were both naked and they were not ashamed. That somehow even there was a psychological change that occurred with the beginning of civilization. And as a matter of fact, that's what happened. When civilization began, that's when you started having, along with agriculture, you had wars, you had empires, and you had priesthood, and you had oppression. You had slavery. These things had not really existed on any kind of a large scale before. Of course, tribal peoples have a lot of little battles, but the large-scale warfare that has characterized all of human history did not exist before the beginning of civilization. And this seems to be what is reflected, the beginning of large-scale sin. And Adam had to make a choice. Adam had to make a choice whether to stay with the primitive lifestyle or to embrace the knowledge and the power that comes from civilization. And he made the choice of the power and knowledge of civilization. And then this was the beginning of agriculture. And as a matter of fact, the 3rd chapter of Genesis talks about how part of the curse that was placed upon Adam was that he would have to till the ground. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth to you. You know what? That actually happened. Thorns and thistles, referring to weeds, actually began with agriculture. Thorns and thistles, that is, weeds, are not wild species that were present before the farm was established. They were species that evolved on the farms. The crops were being bred deliberately, but meanwhile, not as a result of volition, but as a result of an accidental side product of evolution, weeds evolved as well, and they adapted to the cycle of tilling and harvesting, only they did so for their own benefit without offering any benefit to humans. So this is a recognition that not only agriculture, but even the presence of weeds and the toil and the slavery that comes from having to raise food by means of agriculture was part of the fall that came along with civilization. And it's quite possible that that is the idea behind Genesis chapters 2 and 3, and that this was a very ancient memory that was in the mind of the writer of this passage. This is Charles Darwin. Tally ho, and amen.